This is an audio check. If you can't hear this announcement, please ensure that your audio is not muted on your computer and your speaker volume is adjusted. Thank you. This is an audio check. If you can't hear this announcement, please ensure that your audio is not muted on your computer and your speaker volume is adjusted. Thank you. This is an audio check. If you can't hear this announcement, please ensure that your audio is not muted on your computer and your speaker volume is adjusted. Thank you. This This is an audio check. If you can't hear this announcement, please ensure that your audio is not muted on your computer and your speaker volume is adjusted. Thank you. This is an audio check. If you can't hear this announcement, please ensure that your audio is not muted on your computer and your speaker volume is adjusted. Thank you. This is an audio check. If you can't hear this announcement, please ensure that your audio is not muted on your computer and your speaker volume is adjusted. Thank you. This is an audio check. If you can't hear this announcement, please ensure that your audio is not muted on your computer and your speaker volume is adjusted. Thank you. This is an audio check. If you can't hear this announcement, please ensure that your audio is not muted on your computer and your speaker volume is adjusted. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. I'm Toby Graham, University Librarian and Associate Provost at the University of Georgia. UGA established the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame in 2000 to recognize the talent of our state's writers and to promote Georgia's literary legacy. I invite you to learn more about the almost 70 inductees at georgiawritershalloffame.org. We're grateful today to bring you a keynote address by such distinguished an individual as Ralph Eubanks. You'll hear more about Professor Eubanks shortly, and I want to extend my personal welcome and thanks to Ralph for being with us. This event is being held as part of UGA's signature lecture series and part of the university's Spotlight on the Arts Festival, both of which have moved almost fully into the virtual space for this year. The Harvard Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which administers the Writers Hall of Fame, holds the most extensive collection of works written by Georgians and about Georgia and the papers of many of our state's great literary figures. And I acknowledge its director, Catherine Stein, for her leadership of the library, along with Skip Hewlett and Caitlin Dotson. Skip Hewlett has played a vital role in the operation of the Writers Hall since its inception, particularly managing the nominations process and developing an annual exhibit. As Skip moves into retirement at the end of the year, I want to thank him for his 21 years of service to the UGA libraries and the Writers Hall. Leander Nessel from the library's development office is always at the forefront in planning the annual program, and I want to thank her as well. I also need to express our deep gratitude to the late George Montgomery and to Nancy Montgomery, whose love of literature and philanthropic spirit led them to create a Georgia Writers Hall of Fame endowment to ensure that we're able to recognize the literary talent of Georgians for years to come. For any of our previously installed Georgia Writers Hall of Fame inductees with us virtually today, thank you. And I miss seeing you. In particular, our thoughts and our hearts go out to 2006 inductee Terry Kay, who's suffering from a major illness. Frankly, the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame was Terry's idea, and he's been a guiding force ever since. As we celebrate this anniversary, we also lift up and celebrate our friend, Terry Kay. The Georgia Writers Hall of Fame relies on a distinguished panel of judges to determine which authors are inducted, and I'll take a moment to recognize them. First, our previous inductees into the Hall who are serving on the Board of Judges: Michael Bishop, James Cobb, Alfred Korn, John T. Edge, Tayari Jones, Cynthia Shearer, A.E. Stallings, and Kevin Young. From the University of Georgia serving on the board: Lisa Baer, Valerie Boyd, John Insko, John Lowe, Gerald Ma, Hugh Rupersberg, and Catherine Stein. And from elsewhere across Georgia: Peggy Gallus, Sheffield Hale, Julie Hunt, Shell Knox, Lisa White, and Neely Young. Thank you, judges, and I look forward to meeting with you later this month. And now I'd like to bring to you Dr. Gerald Ma, editor of the Georgia Review, who will help us to welcome Ralph Eubanks.
Thank you, Toby. I'm excited about this keynote moment, and I can think of no better person than Ralph to give this talk, and no better time with Georgia, having been in the national spotlight for the past 3 days, and all these places elsewhere scrambling to try to find a narrative of what they see as an inexplicable change in a state that they haven't seen some sort of change in. One thing I want to remind you is, I'll say it now and I'll say it later, if you have questions for us, feel free to post your questions in the Facebook and YouTube comment section, and they'll get relayed over here, and we'll try to fold as many of them into the Q&A at the end of the program as much as possible. Also, I want to remind you that if you buy, please purchase Ralph's books through Avid Bookshop, and or purchase a subscription of the Georgia Review, which is having a holiday sale right now. And if you do so during the day, you will get a free copy of our special Georgia Writers Hall of Fame issue mailed directly to your doorstep. Without further ado. Oh, I'm introducing still. Sorry, that was a little bit of premature. I'm still, in his groundbreaking book, Culture and Society, literary critic Raymond Williams tracks how the word culture changed across the long 19th century. Before the decisive period, the term was first and foremost agricultural, quote, meaning primarily the tending of natural growth, and then by analogy, a process of human training. But this latter use, Williams continues, which had usually been a culture of something, was changed in the 19th century to culture as such, a thing in itself, whether it references the general state of intellectual development in a society as a whole, or the general body of the arts, or a whole way of life, material, intellectual, and spiritual. Williams argues that the modern notion of culture emerged to serve as a primary bulwark for hierarchical distinctions that came into being during this century, and advocated to go back and think of culture as at heart a process rather than a quality, an action rather than something to attain. I can think of very few people in American letters who exemplify this active notion of culture as much as Ralph Eubanks. Not only has he written 3 books and numerous articles in some of the country's most prestigious publications, like the New Yorker, Harper's, the Oxford American, and Vanity Fair, he has, moreover, served as the head of publishing at the Library of Congress, as the editor of Virginia Quarterly Review, and just as importantly, on numerous advisory boards and committees, like Scalawag Magazine and the Southern Foodways Alliance. The active engagement with literature occurs as much on the professional level as on the written one. The dynamic nature of reading, writing, and understanding imbues his published books, Ever is a Long Time, A Journey into Mississippi's Dark Past, published in 2003, and The House at the End of the Road, The Story of 3 Generations of an Interracial Family in the American South, published in 2009. This 2-book project charts the political, social, and cultural import of race in the making of the American Southeast throughout the 20th century by tracking his family history during this crucial period. The latter book telling the story of the multiracial union of his grandparents in Alabama during the first half of the 20th century, and the first book narrating the story of the household and schools that brought him to age in civil rights in Mississippi. These stories can be interesting in and of themselves, but what makes these books especially pleasurable and meaningful is Eubanks's acute sense of the everyday nature of history and the journeys of discovery that these books enact. These are not family narratives shuttered off from the world. What could easily be taken merely as setting in context, like the anti-miscegenation laws of the Jim Crow South, are active agents in the dramatic tale. In these books, the individual stories and the historical situation are mutually revelatory. For instance, not only do the rules, spoken and not, of Jim Crow South teach us what decisions Edna and James Richardson had to make and maintain their family, but also, conversely, the travails of the couple teach us about the nuances of and local negotiations with, local resistances to these race laws, complicating and deepening our understanding of the messy and uneven workings of race in, quote, the Old South. These books emphasize the making of history all the more by leading its reader on a journey of discovery. Each narrative shows us Eubanks in the process of seeking and processing information, of reflecting on what's been learned and engaging conversations that have taken place, all to piece together a narrative of the past meaningful for those in the present moment. Through myriad sources like those from oral history, interviews, archival research, personal memory, literature, and documents like the files from the Sovereignty Commission, we see firsthand Ralph in, quote, the process of human training, in the art of making meaning from and for a life well lived. These 2 commitments are intertwined, of course, method meshing with argument, with worldview. History comprises, Eubanks insists, decisions by ordinary people making ordinary and extraordinary decisions in concert with others. If culture is an active process, then history is necessarily passed down, passed forward, shared in a way that shares agency between generations. I want to end with a touching passage from The House at the End of the Road. Toward the end of the book, Eubanks visits the titular house, his grandparents, with his then 11-year-old daughter, Delaney, who asked her father to stop a bit while leaving. While at the family site, she started to pull moss from the majestic southern trees lining the road in. And as Eubanks watched on, he said, quote, "In the quiet, as I snapped photos of Delaney, I reminded myself that I came back to Prestwick to be a custodian of memory, particularly memories of this place. If all Delaney remembers from this trip is gathering moss, just as I remember my mother doing the same thing, she is a custodian of that memory along with me, which is something we will always share. Delaney's action, her grandmother's, the photo, these all remind us that to be a custodian of memory can and should be an active process. And these stories, these memories, are always only of this place, a particular one, with particular people to care for, to listen to stop and stay with for the time being. W. Ralph Eubanks is currently visiting professor of English and Southern Studies at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi, which is his alma mater, one of his two. He has written the two aforementioned books, and a third, A Place Like Mississippi, A Journey Through a Real and Imagined Literary Landscape, is forthcoming March 2021. He has written for many of the nation's leading magazines and earned fellowships from the Guggenheim and the New America Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Ralph Eubanks.
Thank you very much, John. It's a lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here today. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. And I want to say at a recent gallery exhibition, I found myself suddenly transfixed by a work by a Georgia artist by the name of Kathy Fussell. I've long been captivated by maps as social and historical documents, but this quilted creation was executed by beautiful, intricate stitching that gave the object a texture that projected a sense of a strongly imagined past. The wall label simply said Margravante of Azala, a name possessing an air of ancient, exotic elegance. Until that afternoon, while standing in a gallery in Oxford, Mississippi, I had never heard those rhythmic words either written or spoken before. Yet for some strange reason, I suddenly felt an intense attraction to the object with that name. Then I learned of its connection to Georgia's history. Fussell told me that this was a map of a proposed colony of some 400 square miles that would serve as a buffer in Georgia along the Savannah River. While I engaged with the historical provenance of Fussell's reimagined map of an imagined place, I was reminded of my own lineage and connection with Georgia. My mother's ancestors, the Bassets, were British loyalists who left Georgia and were given a tract of land through a grant from George III. Later, they were joined by my Richardson relatives, cotton gin owners, who also hailed from Georgia. My ancestors' decision to fall onto the wrong side of history, first as British loyalists and later in their support of slavery in the Confederacy, led to my family's slow migration west from the Georgia colony, first to what is now Alabama, and in the late 1940s to Mississippi, where I was born. As someone who for the past 2 years has been immersed in writing about the literary landscape of my home state, it was not until I saw the Margravante of Azala that I began to ponder my connection to the rest of the South. While we like to think of Southern spaces as places where people sink down deep roots, we often forget how, even within the South, its inhabitants have migrated across its state borders to create a connected diaspora of people with a connected regional identity. Sometimes it takes only a single object to set off a flow of memories and connections. The Margravante of Azala also reminded me of how my origins are scattered across the South, and led me to recall how my father always said that anyone with the name of Eubanks, who was from Virginia, must be a relative, since my great-grandmother had been enslaved in the Old Dominion before she was sold to an Alabama plantation owned by a family with the same surname. It also reminded me of when I worked on my second book, The House at the End of the Road, in which I sought to reconstruct the lives of my grandparents, Jem and Edna Richardson, an interracial couple who were secretly married in Mississippi and lived in South Alabama. As I did interviews for that book, I learned how proud my white Richardson relatives were of their ancestral linkage with Georgia, the colonial American past, and particularly English gentry, almost like a boast, since their heritage was different. And since mine was tainted by black blood when my grandfather married my grandmother in 1915. While my own work is connected with Mississippi, my ancestry is connected with Georgia and more broadly, the entire American South. As I explored the biographies of the men and women in the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, I realized that a few of them, like me, share a similar diasporic connection with this state. Jean Toomer was born in my adopted hometown of Washington, D.C., not far from where I now live along the U Street corridor. My walks through the city during the empty days of the pandemic reminded me of the ways Toomer described the city I now live in, as well as his depictions of rural Georgia. Toomer knew how to connect diverse Southern places and spaces. Others, like my friends John T. Edge and Natasha Trethewey, have deep connections in both Georgia and Mississippi. But what connects the work of every writer in the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame is not simply the accident of geography that connects them to the Peach State, but also ways in which each writer has found in their work to both define and explain what it means to be a Southerner. Geography may be fate, but the South is now part of a global culture associated more with the sense of rooted cosmopolitanism than simply a tightly conscribed regional identity. In her essay, The Grotesque in Southern Fiction, Flannery O'Connor wrote, "The Southern writer is forced from all sides to make his gaze extend beyond the surface, beyond mere problems, until it touches that realm that is the concern of prophets and poets." O'Connor touches on the burden of every Southern writer, the need to explain the complexities of this vast and varied region in a way that is both prophetic and universal. But as the South changes, what does the future of Southern writing look like? As the South moves beyond regional exceptionalism, will our need to explain the place still drive the work of its writers? To know the future, we must also know the past. And as O'Connor also reminds us, to write about the South, we must also know the rest of the world while we also focus on our small corner of it. Reading O'Connor's essay led me to ponder two questions. First, what does it mean today to be a Southern writer? And second, is the South still a distinctive place, or is the idea of the South merely an intellectual construct? Let me begin to interrogate those questions by looking at what most people unfamiliar with the South imagine this place to be, and that is largely rural and white. Southernness has far too often been equated with whiteness, in spite of the fact that the very idea of Blackness has its origins in the American South. And that idea of what the South is and who is a Southerner has been part of the way we have constructed the region's identity. In the South, we've long been fixated on our agrarian past as central to the Southern sense of place. John Crow Ransom and his merry band of agrarians at Vanderbilt cast a long shadow over Southern literature, one we are still disentangling ourselves from, whether we are in Georgia or Mississippi. For the agrarians, the South's past was a sacrament, and the only Southern past that mattered was white Southern identity. There was no room to broaden the circle of what it meant to be Southern, nor was there a desire for the region's identity to move beyond its 19th century idea of itself. The diverse group of writers who are part of this Hall of Fame push against the agrarian's idea of who is Southern, as well as the characteristics of a Southerner. This is a group that is both rural and urban, very much rooted in Georgia, but able to see the region in the context of a broader world, rather than simply within the confines of the state's drawn borders. The South that shaped many of the writers in the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame is distinctly from the way we live in the South now. It is less rural, more urban and suburban, and it is more ethnically diverse. Rather than a world that exists within a racial binary, the South is multiracial and multi-ethnic, much like the rest of the country. This changing South is one I often encounter in the classroom when I teach a course in Southern Studies on Southern memory and identity. And it is this changing South I have begun to witness in my students. And this is what I believe will be the greatest influence on the next generation of Southern writers and will redefine Southern letters. My students' South is not the one they encounter in Lillian Smith's Killers of the Dream, with its haunted childhood and world of swamp and palmettos and sinks and endless stretches of pine slashed and dripping their richness into little tin cups that glint like bright money. Nor is their South the one they encounter in Janice Ray's Ecology of a Cracker Childhood. When Ray describes the flat and wide landscape of South Georgia as a land of few surprises, as well as one of cycle and constancy, I ask them to try to imagine growing up in the world Ray describes. Few of them can, since it is rare for me to have a student who comes from humble beginnings like Ray's, or who has an intense connection with the natural world or even the rural South. The South my students have experienced is one that has a different relationship with the natural environment, one rooted in intentional outdoor encounters, instead of a connection with the land based on a culture of farming and daily life. When Janice Ray describes the landscape that shaped her, as I do when I write about Mississippi, we both describe it as something that we feel owns our very bodies. This is something few of my students feel or choose to write about. It is this different and evolving relationship with Southern place that I believe will change the very idea of what it means to be Southern. Young Southerners want to preserve the landscape, but not be defined by it. It doesn't own their bodies, at least not in the same way as their elders. If we all construct our identities from a toolkit of options, I would argue that this generation of Southerners are developing an entirely different toolkit, one that acknowledges the past, yet rejects the way that past was sometimes constructed on a foundation of mythology of race and place. They realize that identity is constructed not just by the words society uses to define people, but also through modes of expression, rather than taking the traditional scripts of identity that have typically been handed to them. Like a good blues musician, they are improvising to construct a new sense of Southern identity, which in turn will influence the narratives that are told about the Southern landscape. This new identity will not just be one that is aligned with the American South, but also within a larger transnational framework. This is the South Cynthia Scherer imagines in her novel, The Celestial Jukebox, set in the Mississippi Delta. with its migrant characters and the new Southern spaces that they create. In writing about the Delta, Scherer brought insights from the culture of her native South Georgia, a place that, like the Mississippi Delta, had the shadow of the legacy of sharecropping as part of its history. Although the agrarian aspect of her setting was familiar, she wanted to look at the Delta from a fresh perspective. She told me, I was interested in documenting the new ethnicities arriving in the Delta, which I saw as hopeful. And I was interested in privileging the outsider African perspective over the white perspective in the novel, because that had not been done before. The idea of embracing narratives from outside the South and making them part of the story of the region is the future of Southern letters. Bear in mind that this is a generation that is also seeking to free itself from lost cause mythology and wants to embrace the Southern past along with all of its blemishes, violence, and complexities. They are haunted less by the sense of loss connected with the Civil War the agrarians felt, and actively seek out the shock of the new. In his book, Tell About the South, Fred Hobson notes that the Southerner, more than any other American, has felt he had something to explain, to defend, or to affirm. But as the South embraces new narratives, will Southern writers and writing feel the need to explain the place so intensely? I think the answer is yes, but what they will be explaining will have as much to do with the South as a place as it does with the South as part of the broader American project. Our next generation of writers is being shaped by a South that calls us to rethink the very idea of what it means to be Southern. Physical manifestations of the lost cause are being toppled to the ground, thrown into rivers, and placed in museums. All of this sudden change has created a sense of urgency to imagine anew the way we conceive narratives that define the South. That is especially true now that Southern symbols like Confederate flags are weaponized as part of political messages beyond the South. It is the job of the Southern writer to both explain how the least appealing aspects of Southern culture are weaponized outside its borders, while also seeking to create a new narrative that overshadows and eclipses the older one. As someone who's spent a great deal of time pondering the connection between geography and literature, I continue to believe the South is a distinctive place. Each time I drive south from Washington to return to Oxford, I'm always taken by the shift in the look and feel of the landscape, the deeper I descend into the Southern plain. As I cross the tip of Georgia and move westward toward Alabama and into Mississippi, I know that I am in a place that is different from the East Coast, where I've lived for nearly 40 years. My South is one that is both haunted and haunting. While there are many unsettled spirits hovering over the Southern landscape, the next generation will be defined less by the ghost of race and violence that cast a shadow over the consciousness of my generation. There is much of the South that is being built and paved over. Yet there are also pieces of it that are being preserved in a way that anyone can feel that they are in a place that is connected with the Southern past, yet not entirely defined by it. What is changing, and has long needed to change, is the idea of the South as an intellectual construct. The concept of Southern place and space has far too long been wrapped up in a romanticized conception of itself. As we begin to confront the meaning of the Southern past, free of mythologies and untruths about who we are and what we have been, our next generation of writers will reimagine what it means to be a Southern writer. Part of that reimagining will be to be less defined by the destiny of geography and more defined by connections with the rest of the world that lie beyond the artificial and ancient demarcation mapped by the Mason-Dixon line. As writer, critic, and observer of the American South, Edouard Glissant once noted, physical frontiers disappear more easily than mental ones. And for a frontier region such as the American South, it is hard to transcend the frontier. Today, there is a proliferation of frontier worlds, some traditional and other suddenly emergent, suggested to some and imposed on other. It is this desire to transcend the frontier and to develop something less traditional and suddenly emergent that I believe is the future of Southern letters. While I am not sure precisely what that will be, I sense and feel a change, and that thrills me. This doesn't mean that the South will no longer be the South, but it does mean that the people of the region, particularly its writers, will begin to reimagine the very idea of this place we call home. As every Georgia school child knows, Robert Montgomery's proposed creation of the Magravante of Azla never came to pass. While it was essentially a real estate development scheme, it was an idea, a work of the imagination. While there is no physical map I can draw or quilt to illustrate the future of Southern letters, I do believe this new idea of the South will come to pass. Right now, we are living through a disruptive time that is giving birth to this idea, this redefinition. As a teacher, I see it as part of my work to foster this new idea, to give creative strength to this disruption. In a generation, we will begin to see how a reimagined South becomes part of the literature of the region, as well as in Georgia writers. As a writer and a student of Southern letters, I can't think of anything more exciting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fantastic talk. We're on to our Q&A section now. And just to remind you, all of you tuning in, if you have a question, post it on the comments section of YouTube or Facebook, and it'll be relayed over here, and we're going to do our best to ask as many of them as possible. They're already popping up, so I don't know if we can get to all of them. Okay. I'm running the show, so I'm going to ask mine first. But one of the things, as I mentioned in the introduction, is you started off your book writing career, at least, with these 2 books about family history, and your forthcoming one is about literature, proper. And I just am interested to hear what you have learned in this transition from family history to literature. The continuities, these are all stories, right? But, what have you learned about the continuities between and the differences between, family history and literature in regards to place?
It's something that's really forced me to recalibrate the way that I write. I have to say, my first draft, I totally pulled back from the personal lens at all. I tried to stay out of the narrative because I wasn't quite sure where I belonged in that. And my editor felt that there was a place for me, and then I had to go and find that place, kind of where, I guess really for me it was, where does the personal and the literary, where do they overlap? And that's what I began to explore. I think just like, in my previous books, I was really looking at the personal and the historical and how they overlapped. I was looking at how I also use setting and place in my work, and how others did that as well. How these places that are in Mississippi there's some places that are both real and imagined. Oxford is not Jefferson, but there are a great deal of similarities. And trying to see where those connections are, and exploring those, as I said, very much in the way that I kind of explored family history. So it was using some of the same toolkit, but also using another side of my academic training in literature. So that I kind of pull that back out again, which was fun to do.
And this is a question from the audience that is similar to what you're talking about, and particularly in terms of when you talked about driving from DC into the South and going back and forth and crossing that permeable border that is both real and imagined. It's in line with that. This audience question is, how do you think the influx of Northern whites into the South over the past decades has impacted Southern culture?
I think that that's part of the new diversity of Southern culture. You see people who come to the South, you see that a lot in Oxford, who begin to embrace the culture of the place, even while they're not really part of it. They're bringing ideas from outside of the region, and that's a very healthy thing, particularly in a place like Mississippi that is, we have the lowest percentage of people with passports of any state in the union. And so our population doesn't migrate out very much. And that's added a different richness to the culture and has challenged some traditional ideas about the region. I think that's a very healthy thing. I think as I said in my talk, I think there's been a lot of crossing across southern borders, but I think now we're seeing this idea of a much more cosmopolitan South. And I think that is one of the things that this migration of people is bringing, this idea of a rooted cosmopolitanism to the South.
I think on the flip side, I don't know if you saw the New York Times Magazine today, but I haven't been in the South for very long. For people who don't know, I started this job in 2019, and I was kind of in coastal urban centers for 20 years. My wife is from Mississippi, since her family's been here for a really long time. Learning by proxy is very different from living here, and I love it. But the front page of the New York Times Magazine has the cover issue is about COVID and the American dream, and its exemplary community is Buford Highway in Atlanta, which is crazy to me. I mean, so there's just so much, and it's obviously, it's slated and they think it's well timed, for right now, but to have the diaspora community in Atlanta be the exemplary community for the American dream it's speaking a lot to what Ralph is talking about Georgia communities and national relevance, and it's going both ways. I think is really interesting. I haven't read the article yet because I was preparing for this, but Ralph, can you tell us what's going on here? What are some of the possibilities for these major media outlets to start considering Southern cities as exemplary or akin to what is called the American dream? Maybe some of the potential pitfalls. Any advice for these people trying to write about the South in a way that is trying to generalize it outside of this history that you're talking about that's shifting?
Well, I think what's good, I mean, I haven't read the article, but perhaps this might be a chance for us to begin to break out of the idea of Southern exceptionalism. That could be a very positive thing. I also do worry about writers who do kind of, really parachute in and have an idea of the place rather than spending time and understanding it in full. That's always a concern of mine. I mean, I often tell people that I said, why do you teach at the University of Mississippi? Well, I teach Southern Studies. I said, but I do feel that I should really be teaching Southern Studies in the Northeast because they could learn a great deal from this region about, there'd be some cross regional understanding. And it's interesting, I'm actually doing a program with the Mississippi Humanities Council in December where we're talking with people from Massachusetts, so kind of a cross-cultural between the two states, since we can't really travel. And I think that's what's, this cross-cultural understanding is going to be important, whereas Southerners have really been, we've been thought of as a very provincial group of people. It's also a bit of a stereotype, but I think the migration people has forced us to change that. Did that answer your question?
I have no question. I'm just a little dumbfounded, and I'm excited to see what's happening. Because in coming here, as I said, from coastal, from both coasts, I was really excited to take on a job at the Georgia Review, which has a commitment to the region. So its kind of origin is a commitment to the region, but over its long lifespan, it has invested a lot in national and international conversation, and to merge the two, which is basically what you're saying in your talk, is the key, right? To think locally, to act locally and think locally and invest locally, but also to understand globally and nationally. And I was just excited that Georgia was a bellwether in 2018, and it's just exciting that this conversation's happening. It feels sometimes like I'm waking up in a Willy Wonka land or something, but because
it's a very important. I think the South will always be the South, but it's going to be very different from the South of my childhood, where as I said, people really stayed in very tightly defined places for generations. There's a lot more moving around, and I just see in my students, they're wanting to see their connection between not only the South and the rest of the country, but the rest of the world. And that's an important connection to make. That's not, I often tell people, when I was a student at the University of Mississippi in the 70s, this was a university that educated the next generation of Mississippians, citizens of Mississippi. Now we're trying to educate the next generation of citizens of the world. That's a very different mission, and a very different mindset that your faculty and administration will take on.
Yeah, Georgia has a similar thing here. I think the Wilson Center has an initiative called Global Georgia. There's an audience question here that says, the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame celebrates literature that represents the land of Georgia and celebrates the beliefs of the Georgian people. With Georgia flipping blue for the first time in 28 years, what effect will this change in the political voice of the citizens of Georgia have on the literature honored by the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame?
I'm not so sure we'll have as much of an influence on the writing, maybe some of the political writing about Georgia. So maybe from a nonfiction standpoint. But I think the idea of Georgia changing and transforming politically will, again, I think, allow people to see that this idea of the South being this monolith, that's not really what the South is. And I always say there's a different culture within each state, and even within each state, there are pockets of culture. As a student here at the University of Mississippi in the 70s, I could tell where someone was from at one time just by I could tell if they were from Yazoo City or if they were from Clarksdale or from South Mississippi. I knew the accents. That's not quite as true anymore. So I think maybe what the impact will be on literature is that people may not be thinking about so much about that small postage stamp that they're kind of focusing on. They'll have a much broader canvas to think about. that may be the real impact.
I mean, I think a question that can come from this is, in your kind of research or in your kind of lifespan, your lifelong thought about imagination, storytelling, and place. Another way to ask this question or to kind of continue this question is, what do you see literature doing? Glissant talks about, there's a real frontier and there's the imagined frontier. And the imagined frontier in some ways can be less permeable. What is literature doing in preparation for, say, historical changes, during historical changes, or afterwards? It makes me think of, when your beginning anecdote about the Hoffman map, I think it is, you said, there's this great phrase, you said, I had always prized maps for their social and historical, purposes. And here you are. And there was, it's an aesthetic object that really kind of catalyzed this, the flow of memories, and
it's got the
different way.
Frontier inside of it, really. I mean, that's really kind of what's there. It's almost, but yeah, the imagined frontiers are, as Glissant says, a lot less permeable. I do think that we are beginning to permeate this. I think that that's something that Tayari Jones does really well in her work, because I'm just thinking about An American Marriage. That's a book that's set in Atlanta. You know that it's a Southern landscape, but you're thinking about how those characters fit into the broader American project. They just happen to be in the South. And does that make it really something that someone outside of the region's not interested in? No, but it makes it by having it in that place, it tells you a certain amount of history about those people without really having to get too much into the backstory of it all. Because I think what Jones is saying there, that backstory. I don't need to go into that. I can just work with these characters and tell this story. And so I think that's a way maybe that we're beginning to permeate that imagined frontier that we usually will shy away from, that a lot of artists shy away. I mean, I think Jesmyn Ward in Mississippi does the very same thing. She is thinking much less about that past. It's there. She is trying to keep you in this imagined present. And that past, but she doesn't have to tell it to you.
My two left thumbs closed the thing. I'm sorry. But I heard Atlanta, and it felt like a godsend, because there is an audience question about Atlanta, and so I think there's a way to, but this, and I didn't catch the author of that novel or story. Who was it? Jones?
Jones.
Which Jones?
Tayari Jones.
Okay, Tayari Jones. Okay. This audience question is, there's a saying that Atlanta is the gateway to the South. How has that been covered in any writings you have read? Partially answered already. And do you feel Atlantans have a more heightened sense of expressing their stories about the South in a certain way because of that?
I think, using Jones as an example, I think she's thinking about Atlanta not only as a gateway to the South, but also as this this hub of kind of not even leaving the South as well, connecting to other places. Thinking about going into Hartsfield Airport, you can go anywhere in the world. That's a very, that's not the Atlanta airport of my childhood. It was more like a passageway from somewhere else. It was always, if you're going anywhere in the South, even if you're on your way to hell, you had to go through Atlanta. So I think that's, so the Atlanta as a gateway it's much more as a gateway, I think, to thinking about this globally connected South. And as I said, I think Tayari Jones does that very, very well in her work. Whether it's in Leaving Atlanta or in her most recent book, An American Marriage.
There's the 19th century Romantic poet has this, Samuel Taylor Coleridge has this great, one of the strong senses of aesthetic creation, or the symbol is multeity and unity, and how, the greatest aesthetic creations have a unified whole. Provisional unified whole is I think the real reading of it. It's, I think it's misread a lot, but it has a momentary unified whole that has to deal with a multeity within it. And, that's very much, not only what you're talking about. I mean, that's what you're talking about with, the South and Georgia, and the fact that people, if you think you're Southern, you're always crossing borders, your family's crossing borders, within the South. And these end up being concentric circles almost, right? Like, when you cross the boundary from Mississippi to Alabama, you're still trying to, there's these, there's the South, there's the United States. What do you can speak personally or, as a critic or intellectually, but when you cross like one boundary, say, state boundaries, what can you learn about the kind of the outer one, if that makes sense? I don't know. Like, so when Mississippians, if they don't fly to, Slovenia or Rome, but, they drive, to see family in Tennessee, even these crossing of boundaries on a kind of, on what might seem a more local level, teaches us something about the outer kind of boundaries. And
well, I have to say, what I often think is once I get across that little patch of Georgia outside of Chattanooga, I'm on largely, well, it's a 4-lane road, but it's not an interstate highway crossing Alabama, and it is much more rural. I go for ages without seeing anything that would resemble anything urban, perhaps till I get to Huntsville. And what I notice primarily is, I know when I'm leaving Tennessee, how I'm leaving Appalachia, and I think about how difficult those passages were at one time, and how easy it is now, which meant those stories remained in those places, and they do travel around a lot more. So there's much more cross-fertilization of stories and storytelling tradition. Something I was reminded of years ago when I was on Cape Breton Island, and someone told me the music there is the purest because they are the most isolated. And we don't have that right now. There's not that isolation. So when I'm crossing there, I do think a lot about that move from Appalachia to Lower Appalachia, the isolation of places that are there. And then you see the little markers of stories that people are there. I'm driving across the Trail of Tears. I mean, that's the marker I see. So I'm always thinking about that as I'm making that trek. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I guess I'm always thinking about how Tennessee, and even just East Tennessee, is very different than Northern Alabama, which is, in Alabama having its kind of different island communities, and Mississippi being these very interconnected small towns within a state without really a large city, and how different those cultures are. And yet we all place them under the umbrella of Southern. But, it's the idea that we always come back to in Southern studies, there's so many Souths. And we're always trying to get people to see that there are lots of different Souths, rather than this monolithic idea of the South that I have witnessed my friends who I brought from the East for the first time to the South bring with them. And they leave without that, which is really great to see.
There's something really, I'm just a little shooting from the hip a little bit. I mean, there is the ease of mobility is easier exponentially. And then, we have this internet thing that, sends out messages at, whatever speed to wherever. But I think that, one of the things I learned from your books and, what you're talking about right now is that there is something about oral stories that feel they stay in a place, don't they? I mean, even though people leave, they just seem to kind of just, if there's something that stews, maybe not is rooted. I mean, I wouldn't be so, but there's some, if something stews and sits for a long time, I would say it's oral history in a lot of ways. And it is beautiful to kind of go into a hospitable community and, see what they've been talking about for a really long time and take that away. I feel like, the speed of the modern world is still, in some ways, can't compare to just the rootedness of oral stories.
Well, I think even better, get them to talk about something they haven't wanted to talk about, that they have chosen to be silent about. And the South is filled with those stories where there are things that there's been this choice to be silent about. And I have to say, as a writer, those are the ones that really interest me the most, because that's where you can kind of tease out these connections with the past, but also see how that relates in some way to the present.
I think I saw something from the Mississippi Book Festival. You had a panel with Imani Perry, and I think it was right after Charlottesville. And
yes,
you said something along the lines of, and it was about race. You said something about races. It's better to engage it. One should engage it and not avoid it. And I think,
I think that there is a tendency to avoid it. I'm often asked, why do I keep bringing these things up? And I said, because they're these things that we are silent about, that people don't really know anything about. I mean, very much like, when I always ask my students, do they know what the Sovereignty Commission is? And they don't. A lot of them have been educated in Mississippi, yet that's not part of the story that people want to tell about the state. But it's one that I really believe should be part of it. So the things that we choose to be silent about in the South are things that I think are the stories that are can be most compelling.
And here's a question from Toby, the master archivist of Mississippi. A question: any observations about the export of Southern literature, art, music as it undergoes change? Does it also affect changes beyond the South?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, I think the art form that we've seen the most change with is the blues. And we've seen how that is really, as it's moved around the world, that's really changed. I'm always fascinated by how many people are really, how many Frenchmen are still fascinated by Faulkner. We are still fascinated by Faulkner, but the French have a particular connection with Faulkner. But the South, I think, it's something that people see as exotic, even perhaps when it's not. So I think that exotic air that it exudes, very much like the map we started talking about at the beginning, is what attracts people to it. And then as people are attracted to that, it does change as it migrates into other cultures, just as the blues did when it was discovered by British musicians. They took it and made something different. Or just like the blues that you will hear now performed in Clarksdale will be very different than what you would have heard in the 50s when I was born. So.
Great. Well, we have to wrap up, and there are a number of questions here. I want to encourage those whose questions we unfortunately couldn't get to, just read Ralph's work. His essays and his books they're so capacious in their engagement of culture and history and literature. You'll probably be able to get some sort of answer to your question and have many more questions if you were to read his work. I want to remind you that please purchase your author copies from Avid Bookshop. The links should be up they'll be sent to Facebook or YouTube. If you purchase your books from Avid Bookshop, or purchase your subscription to the Georgia Review and type in the little GWHOF in the comment box, we'll send you a free copy of the commemorative issue of the Georgia Writer Hall of Fame as a thank you gift for staying and watching and engaging. And I want to thank Ralph. I want to thank Leandra. I want to thank Monumental Media and the Hargreaves Library and everybody for helping us stage this conversation and give us the opportunity to hear Ralph speak.
Well, thank you for having me here today.